Accidentally saying chest hair in Chinese when you actually mean panda is certainly amusing, but it rarely causes misunderstandings. Let's talk about some tone errors that actually do cause confusion. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about tones, and more specifically, we're going to talk about when tones actually do influence communication. Because even though tones are very important, it's usually the case that in context, if you make a single mistake, people can usually figure out what you mean anyway. But there are some situations and some words where if you mess up the tone, it will be really hard to understand what you're saying. Or conversely, if you listen to someone speaking Mandarin and you mishear a tone, it might be very hard to understand what they're actually talking about. Before we get into that though, I'd like to mention that my pronunciation course is now open for registration again, and it will remain open until November 15th. And this is a full video course covering everything you need to know about pronunciation, making it suitable for beginners who want to get the basics right from the start, and more advanced students who want to fix their errors or polish their accents. For more information about the course, check the link in the show notes or go to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. And if you listen to this after the course has closed, you'll still be able to leave your email address so I can contact you when the course opens again. So let's talk a little bit about tones and tone errors and how they influence communication. This is something I have talked about on the podcast before, and in general, tones are of course very important, and I think the best way of explaining how important tones are is to use the analogy of long and short vowels in English, because that's something that many native speakers of Chinese struggle with, and just like we seldom hear the tones when we start learning Chinese as adult foreigners, native speakers who learn English as adults seldom hear the difference between long and short vowels either. So, for example, bit and beat are obviously two different words in English for native speakers of English, but if vowel length is not a thing in your native language, it might be difficult both to hear this, but also to use it when you speak English yourself. I will return to this a little bit later in this episode, but for now we can just note that tones in Mandarin are very important, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people will not understand anything you say if you make a single mistake. Just like mixing up a vowel sound in English doesn't mean that your English is completely incomprehensible. This is because listening comprehension is a lot more complex than people normally think, so when we hear something, we don't just extract information from what we hear, we also use expectations, knowledge about the situation and context and so on to actually hear the words themselves. So that means that in the right context, you might not even notice that somebody makes a mistake, even though they did, and you understand perfectly well what they mean. In other cases, there might be an obvious clash between what you hear and what you expect to hear. So if somebody suddenly inserts a word like chest hair into a discussion about pandas, there's really no likely scenario where you will think that this person actually meant chest hair. You're just more likely to think that they mispronounced something else, probably panda in this case. So to explain what's going on here, in Chinese, panda is xiong mao. So that would be bear plus cat, xiong mao. A rising tone followed by a high tone. Chest hair, on the other hand, is xiong mao, so that's xiong high tone, mao rising tone, xiong mao. And these words are only different in their tones, so that means that if you mix the tones up, you can say one when you actually mean the other, just like if you get vowel length wrong in English, you can mix up bit and beat. So if you look online for materials about tones and tone mistakes and how important they are for Chinese, you will find many lists and articles about this type of error, although these really don't influence communication that much at all. Maybe there is someone out there who has had a conversation that was gravely misunderstood because you meant to say panda but you accidentally said chest hair, or maybe the other way around, but I doubt it. You really have to come up with contrived examples for this to be something that could be misunderstood in context, and that is the point, like I said earlier. And that means that in context, most of these listed amusing examples actually aren't a problem. We already talked about panda and chest hair, but there are also many other examples that look a little bit more realistic, but still actually don't cause confusion that often. So for example, we have two words, 眼睛, so that's eyes, and then we have 眼镜, which is glasses. Now, if you were to say something like 我找不到我的眼睛, Well, people are not going to think that you dropped your eyeballs somewhere and that you now need to go and find them, but they're just going to assume that you mispronounced 眼睛, because, well, that makes more sense in context and that's the only thing you could have meant. Another example I've seen dozens of times is when versus when. So when means to kiss and when means to ask, such as asking a question. But if you say 如果你有事你可以吻我, it's highly unlikely that someone will actually think that this is an instruction to kiss them if you have something you want to bring up with someone. It's so much more probable that you just mispronounced a word and that in context this is actually interpreted correctly as when instead of when. My final example here is that if you try to buy a ticket to Shanghai, the Chinese person in the ticket kiosk will probably not think that you want to hurt someone, they will just assume that you are a foreigner who actually wants to go to Shanghai. So in all these examples, we could in theory say that, yeah, tones are very important because you might end up saying panda instead of chest hair, saying that you've lost your eyes instead of your glasses, and so on. But in real life, in real communicative settings, these types of tone errors typically don't cause many misunderstandings at all. Of course, if you make tone mistakes on every single word, your Chinese will be very hard to understand, but that's not particular to this type of word pairs that you can easily mix up. The reason for this is, of course, that there is context. And if we were to continue our earlier example with short and long vowels in English, let's say that it's summer and you live near the coast, and you also have a Chinese-speaking friend who speaks good English but still has some pronunciation issues. And one day you are talking on the phone, you're checking in how things are going recently and so on, and she then suggests to go to the beach and play some volleyball and swim in the ocean. Now, the risk of misunderstanding here is close to zero. Well, she did technically say bitch instead of beach, but in context, when you're talking with someone, maybe you've even been to the beach with this person many times before, context will just fill in the blanks, and if you're used to this person speaking like this, maybe you won't even notice. If you're not, you probably will notice, but you will understand what they mean. You will not be utterly confused, shake your head, and have no idea what they're talking about. And this is, of course, the way most of the amusing examples of tone mistakes would be treated in real life. That's actually not what I want to talk about in this episode, though, but I felt that I needed to explain how this actually works in real communication to make sure that everybody's on board, because there are some tone problems that really will cause a lot of confusion, and I'm talking about some specific pairs of words, and I will go through this in a minute, that have some things in common beyond causing confusion if you get them wrong. So first, they are usually interchangeable in a grammatical sense, so they can be used in the same place in a sentence. This is actually true for many of the amusing examples we have looked at as well, so syntactically they can be put in the same place in a sentence, even though semantically they don't make sense, i.e. the meaning is completely outrageous or weird. But they do still work in the same type of sentence. The next criteria for words that are actually going to cause real misunderstandings is that they are used in the same context and usually have related but obviously not the same meaning. And this is definitely not true for chest hair and panda then. The third criteria is related to both the previous ones, because if misunderstanding is really going to be a problem, it needs to be a mistake that isn't immediately found out. Because if either you or the person you are talking to realizes that there has been a mistake, you can usually solve that using normal communicative strategies. But if neither of you actually realizes that there is a mistake here, then the conversation can sometimes be going on for a long time before you realize that there is a problem. And sometimes you actually never realize that there is a problem. Okay, so let's look at the list that I have compiled and also extended a little bit with people who have left comments to this article on Hacking Chinese. And if you have an example you think causes real confusion, and note here, I don't mean amusing things like chest hair and panda, I mean things you've said that people have really misunderstood completely. Or maybe you've misheard someone say something and you thought they were talking about one thing, but they were talking about something else, and this caused actual problems. Well, if you have such an example, please leave a comment on Hacking Chinese so I can extend the list further. So the first example I have is 买 versus 卖. So that's buying versus selling, a low tone versus a falling tone. I think most learners of Chinese have problems with this pair at some point, and even as an advanced learner I sometimes make this mistake, although I always hear that I make it, so I can correct it immediately myself. If you systematically mispronounce these words, it is actually possible to have a rather long conversation, say about buying an apartment, but they are actually trying to sell an apartment, or they're talking about selling their apartment, and you think that they are buying. And if you don't have enough background information and detailed knowledge about the sale here, you could have a full conversation and still not realize that there's something wrong. The next example is nali versus nali, or if you want, nar versus nar. This is another pair that most students encounter early in their Chinese learning journeys, and this pair causes confusion if you mix them up because they can be placed in the same type of sentence, unlike in English. So in English we would say something like it's there versus where is it. So apart from the words themselves being different, the word order is also different, making it very unlikely that somebody thinks a question is actually a statement or the other way around. In Chinese, the word order is exactly the same though, so the only thing separating the sentences is tone and also maybe intonation, because one is a question and one is a statement, but this is something that many beginners struggle with anyway. And maybe this particular pair doesn't cause long-term confusion, but it does cause confusion if people think that you're asking a question when you're actually pointing something out, or the opposite, you are pointing something out but they think you're asking a question. The next two pairs on my list are both language related, so we have Hanyu and Hanyu. The first one, Hanyu, means Chinese language and Hanyu means Korean. And since you can conceivably study both or have studied both or speak both, it is very confusing if you say Hanyu when you mean Hanyu and the other way around. If you just started learning Chinese and you're saying Hanyu consistently, i.e. Korean, many people will just assume that you mean Chinese and you're fine. But if you study both, or if you've studied Korean before and you say Hanyu and you actually mean Korean, people might even think that you're mispronouncing Chinese, whereas in fact you're not. So this is again very context dependent, so if somebody knows you're studying Chinese, they are much more likely to think that that's the word you meant, even if you actually pronounced it incorrectly and it came out as Korean. There's another pair of these languages that is common, at least if you study in Taiwan, and that is Taiyu, which is Thai language, so in Thailand, not Taiwan. And the other one is Taiyu, which is then Taiwanese. Personally, I only speak a very limited amount of Taiwanese and no Thai, so this is not a problem for me. I've never encountered this. But I've had many classmates from Thailand over the years studying Chinese in Taiwan, and this actually then does cause confusion if you're not careful with the tones. My next example is chou versus chou. So chou means smelly and chou means ugly. And this is a good example of something that can remain a misunderstanding throughout the whole conversation and never get found out. Because if you say that you think something is chou, but you actually mean chou, many things could be both, and it's very hard to know which one it is in some cases. Well, if you're talking about a painting you didn't like, well, of course, chou makes much more sense than chou. But if you're talking about, say, a person you don't like or something else, it's not so obvious. I don't think this is likely to lead to real trouble, though, but I do think that this is a good example of a tone error that can remain unknown or unrevealed throughout a conversation. Next up, we have the favorite of anybody who has ever studied Chinese geography, and I guess this must be a pain for people who study Chinese geography without also studying Chinese, because we have two provinces, Shanxi and Shanxi, that are pronounced exactly the same, but one has a high tone on the first syllable and one has a low tone, so Shanxi versus Shanxi. And in English, when writing about these provinces, you usually insert an extra A into Shanxi to make sure you know which one it is. To add insult to injury, these two provinces are also next to each other, so they are even more likely to cause confusion for beginner students. If you want to see where these provinces are located, you can check the cover image of this episode, and there you have Shanxi in blue and then Shanxi in red. And Shanxi is the eastern of the two provinces, even though they both, of course, have Xi West in their names. The next example that can cause confusion sometimes is 杯子 versus 杯子. So 杯子 means glass or cup, and 杯子 means quilt. And these might not normally be words that you mix up. If you are in a coffee shop and you ask for a 杯子, I think people will understand that you meant 杯子, but with the wrong tone. However, there are some situations, maybe at home if you feel cold and you want someone to get your 杯子 or your 杯子. Both could be right. The 杯子, maybe you poured hot tea in it recently and you want someone to bring it to you, but the 杯子 is also nice to have because you can cozy up and get warm that way. Another word pair that has a slightly higher risk of confusion is hua versus hua. So hua means flower and hua means painting. And again, in a household context, these can be mixed up if you want to, I don't know, maybe buy a painting or a flower, or if you want to decorate something in some way. And admittedly, this isn't very likely to cause communication issues and definitely not serious trouble, but if we're talking about what you want to buy and what you like and so on, this can actually cause confusion, and I've been in situations where it does. A similar situation that I encounter a lot when teaching, but which isn't really something that happens in real life very often, is shu versus shu. So shu here would be book and shu would be a tree. So all of these, flower versus painting and book versus tree, are very common nouns that are pronounced the same but only differ in tone. And so I think many students have struggled with these. I remember playing a word guessing game, and for more about that, a link in the description, but you are describing a word without using the word itself, and the other people are supposed to guess what the word is. And this beginner student said, 有很多书. And his classmates immediately guessed 图书馆, library, but the actual answer was meant to be 森林, forest, because, well, he meant to say shu, not shu. Next, we have something that can cause confusion and maybe even trouble if you end up buying the wrong fruit. So we do have 栗子 and we have 李子. 栗子 is chestnut and 李子 is plum. And both of these things are fruit that Chinese people like to eat and buy. So if you go to the store to get one and you get home with the other, you are in trouble. And of course, if you know what you wanted to eat, this is not a problem, but you can consider somebody else asking you to buy 栗子 for you, and you come home with 李子. We do also have 梨, which is pear, but this normally doesn't come with a z at the end, so it's just 梨, not 梨子. But in theory, we could consider a three-way confusion here between 梨, chestnut, 梨, plum, and 梨, pear. And finally, the example that I think is one of the best ones because it causes trouble all the time when you talk about TV series in Chinese if you don't get your tones right. So we have the two words 季 and 集. So 季 means season and 集 means episode. This pair causes trouble when discussing TV series in Chinese, because if you get the words wrong here, it's very hard for people to follow what you're talking about, especially if you're talking about a TV series that you've both watched. If you keep saying the second season, but you actually mean the second episode, or you mix these up in some other way, it will be really difficult to keep track of what you're talking about. I think this last example is really one of the best because these words are used in very similar contexts, they mean very similar things related to exactly the same thing, and everything is essentially identical except for the tone. So here you really need to get the tone right. So these are all the examples I've been able to collect, and I've actually tried collecting these examples for maybe a decade. And this should tell us a few things. Well, first it could be that I'm not very good at collecting examples, so if you have your own examples, please do head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. But the lack of really good examples could also mean that normally when we listen or when we speak, a single word being wrong usually doesn't cause trouble because there is always context. And this is true not just for tones, but for initials and finals and other parts of the language as well. This doesn't mean that we can just throw tones out of the window and ignore them, of course, because the more mistakes you make in general, the harder it will be to understand what you say, and if you make mistakes on key words, that is going to cause trouble. However, if you get tones wrong on a specific word, maybe you say chest hair instead of panda when you've been to the zoo, that is maybe a little bit amusing, and maybe it could be embarrassing too, and people might stop a little bit in the conversation, but that's really all there is. Unless, of course, you encounter examples that I've mentioned in this episode. That's all I wanted to share today, so good luck with your tones, and don't forget to check out my pronunciation course at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com or check the link in the description. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.